Battlefield 5 is not far away, and as we all now know, we're heading back to World War II. And not all of the Battlefield fans are happy with this decision. Ultimately, you can't please everyone about the setting of the game though. And while I know it's a little bit early to be thinking about the next game in the franchise, let's call it Battlefield 6 for now, before BF5 has even launched, but recently I can't help but wonder what a modern Battlefield game would look like if it released right now in 2018. Most recently, BF3, 4 Hardline and Bad Company 2 have all been modern shooters with some elements of future and past technology appearing in them all. Fans have long wondered, will we ever see a Bad Company 3 game? And you know, we might one day, but perhaps DICE would rather focus on new experiences for now rather than going back to explore the Bad Company universe. We'll see. Now then, back in May of this year, a new Battlefield style game was announced called World War III, and I've already released an overview video of what it might turn out to be, and it's being developed by a relatively small studio called Farm 51. Why am I saying this? Well, I've seen quite a few people, mostly Battlefield fans, show a lot of interest in this game because on paper it sounds like it's going to offer a Battlefield style experience in a modern setting. Something that BF5 of course is not doing this year. It's funny I think, because when we've got a modern game, players often call for something set in the past, and then when we've got the past, they want modern again. We are a funny bunch, aren't we? Either way, the World War III game looks interesting to me, but I really need to either get hands-on with it or see some real gameplay before I get too excited for it. With it being developed by a relatively small-sized studio by today's AAA standards, it will be interesting to see how polished the game turns out to be. The trailer, for example, showed off some pretty ropey-looking animations at times, but hopefully Gamescom answers some of these questions and I can get some hands-on and maybe capture of the game. But what if Battlefield went back to a modern day setting? What would that sort of game look like? What features that we currently have would be brought across? Well, imagine for a second a Cold War setting. I know that this has been suggested before and rumoured, but it's important to know that the Cold War spanned an incredible amount of time from the late 40s all the way to the early 90s. Now, if you aren't familiar with the Cold War, it wasn't a war in the sense of that word. There was no large-scale warfare, let's say. Instead, it was a very long period of tension between the Western world, i.e. America and their NATO allies, and of course the Soviet Union and its allies. It didn't involve any direct military action. Instead, the war, for want of a better term, was fought through economic and political actions. But what if it wasn't? What if the Cold War went hot? BF1 and BF5 are following real conflicts, World War I and World War II. Sure, some liberties have been taken in certain areas, but they're at least based around real wars and locations and the countries involved in those wars. BF3 and BF4, on the other hand, weren't based on real conflicts at all. So what if the next Battlefield game was based around the Cold War, but it goes hot and escalates into a fully fledged war, which I guess you could indeed call World War III. And in my head the game would be set around the 70s to 80s, when perhaps the USA and its Western allies go to war with the Soviet Union. Because I think there's a nice sweet spot there in terms of the technology available and also just the retro feel of that time period. Now, if this was real, DICE would have an element of creative freedom to do what they saw fit to make an interesting game, both for the single player and the multiplayer, without too many restrictions based on the real world events. I think it would still need to be based firmly in reality though. Now, from what I learnt in history class and from what I've seen on TVs and movies, in my head the Cold War period is between the 70s and the 80s. And I think that that period, as I mentioned, had some really interesting landscapes, vehicles and weapons. You could still have your modern day guns, but just not too modern. Weapons like the AK-47, the M16, the M249, the PK machine gun, the Dragunov sniper rifle, the M21, the list goes on. And I think that way weapons would be modern enough without being either too futuristic or too old or too similar to what we had in BF3 and BF4. Maybe in terms of modifying the weapons too, we could have a Medal of Honor Warfighter style system which was very in depth. The weapons of that time period had a lot of different attachment options, and I know that a lot of people loved how many that they were in BF4. I think there were maybe a bit too many in that game, but a nice balance could be made. And when it comes to vehicles, well, you'd still have access to tanks like the Abrams tank or the C-130 Hercules military transport, even the attack helicopters like the AH-1 Cobra. There are some incredible and iconic vehicles and weapons from that time period that I would love to see come together in a Battlefield game. And one thing that that time frame does have going for it is that most of the weapons and vehicles would be quite analog, a bit like how it is in BF5. For instance, maybe not that many automatic lock-on rocket launchers that could take down helicopters. Skill shots, therefore, would be much more needed, like they are in BF5. Of course, you don't want choppers to be too overpowered, so some balance is always needed, but I think when any gameplay element is made more about skill than automatic and fire and forget, it just works out for the best. And because of the setting, I guess that we would see the jet and helicopter combination too, something we haven't experienced since BF4. And that's a tricky one because I know that lots of players enjoy the helis in BF3 and BF4. And I have to say that I really do enjoy playing in them, even though I wasn't that amazing, but they're always a lot of fun. That being said, sometimes it's very hard to balance a map with multiple tanks, choppers and jets all at the same time. And I think BF3 and 4 to some extent suffered from that on a lot of the maps, and it's very hard to find a balance. Perhaps some maps could have helis, some jets, but not both, unless it could be finely balanced. Just a thought. And think about this too, the Vietnam War took place between 1955 and 1975, and while it had no connection to the Cold War, imagine if it did in this game. After all, we'd be utilising an alternative version of history, so why not? And I think there would be a lot of interesting ideas that DICE could explore within an alternate history setting. Of course, Vietnam could just be for extra content, more maps, more weapons, flamethrowers, or even a DLC. I know that that's been done before with Bad Company 2, and even before BF5 was announced, I saw a lot of hope from community members that the next game was indeed going to be based in Vietnam. I'm still not sure that there'd be enough content there for a AAA game these days to have a full game released and all set in Vietnam, especially when you think about the 2 years worth of extra content, but in this fictional version of World War III you could include the Vietnam setting, or even in the main story. It could be really interesting. But in terms of gameplay features, what would stay from current Battlefield games? Well, I think the core pillars of the game would be there. Massive scale vehicle warfare, it's just not Battlefield without it. Destruction would remain similar to how it is in BF5. That means a nice level, but still with an element of balance to it. And I think let's keep the new gunplay too, recoil based skilled gunplay. And I think that for the most part, that change to the way that Battlefield infantry play works has been very well received. I would love to play a modern-ish Battlefield game with M16s and AKs that have skill-based recoil to them. Spotting would of course be minimal, just like it is in BF5. I personally wouldn't have any gadgets that could do it either. And you know what, let's remove it from the minimap too. I love the idea of having a Battlefield game with no spotting, and BF5 has taken a huge step forward in that respect. I doubt there are many people wanting spotting back in the game like it is in Battlefield 1 for example, where you just don't even need to think, you spam the Q button or the spot on the controller and everyone lights up like a Christmas tree. But honestly, the way that I see this potential modern game is mostly adopting all of the changes from BF5. The direction that the game has gone in terms of gunplay, spotting and less explosive spam, the overall experience is a breath of fresh air for me, and I'd love to see the franchise stay in that direction regardless of whatever themes the next games take. If I'm being 100% honest though, I think that I will miss 5-man squads, even if an even number of players does make sense for 64 players. Although, how often are squads always full? Not very. But another aspect of this that we can't overlook is that arguably sometimes the future of the Battlefield franchise depends on sales of each individual game. If BF5 doesn't sell very well, and it was thought to be because of a potential accessibility problem with the game being set in the past in World War II, or even not as accessible as BF1 was, then that could mould the franchise. Let's hope not though. I don't think that will happen. I think that BF5 will definitely be a big seller, even though they've dropped the ball a bit with the marketing. I think importantly the gameplay speaks for itself. Now when it comes to DLC for a potential new modern Battlefield game, perhaps you could have a system where each DLC covers a certain era of the Cold War, or at least our version of the Cold War. Say DLC 1 covered the 50s, and then DLC 2 the 60s, 70s, 90s, etc. You get it. And I think there's a reasonable amount of scope there, especially when it comes to new technology for vehicles, weapons and maps. And that's really what you want with a game. I think you need plenty of potential content and variety. The single player could be interesting too. I loved the Black Ops 1 Call of Duty theme and the time setting of the single player, and that was set during the Cold War, and I think they just absolutely nailed the aesthetic of it all. The weapons, the setting, the soundtrack, I just love that era. It feels so retro and cool. But of course, the Cold War gone hot is just one idea. If Battlefield ever went fully modern again, say set in the year 2020 and things are escalating between the US and Russia and North Korea, or potentially slightly futuristic, then that could be an entirely different experience. Going back to the World War III game that we mentioned earlier, that game has drones and all sorts of future tech like RC cars with bombs on, and I think that if Battlefield went in that direction, it would be a vastly different game than if it just stayed a little bit further back in time. BF4 of course did dabble with futuristic tech in the Final Stand DLC, and I'm sure that you all remember the railgun and hover tanks. Overall though, I'm still super excited for BF5. That's the next game up for us in reality, but I'm also very interested and I enjoy speculating about what the future holds for the Battlefield franchise and the direction it will take. Because I know that loads of people have been asking for a modern game. And now with World War I and World War II covered, you have to assume that the next game will head back towards a more modern or future setting, and that opens up a lot of possibilities even if it's a ways down the road. And that's all for today guys, thank you so much for watching. What's your perfect idea of a modern Battlefield game? What era would it be set in? What kind of weapons, vehicles and locations would you love to fight in? Do let me know in the comments below guys, and if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, that would be much appreciated, thank you. If you didn't like it, dislike it, not a problem. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you in the next one.